No, it's not just to protect the big clubs. Can we please stop saying this? Back in the early 2000s, European football had a massive financial problem. Following an incredibly long and sustained period of having almost no regulation, the sport had found itself blossoming into a new age at the turn of the millennia. A new, insatiable surge in demand for live, televised sport in the digital age brought with it an explosion in broadcasting revenue and elevated football across Europe to an unprecedented status of wealth and exposure. With independent regulation practically non-existent, leagues allowed participating clubs total freedom of administration and thus began a free-for-all arms race to establish dominance before the window of opportunity would shut. According to this Sporting Intelligence research from 2011, the average wage of a footballer in the English First Division sat at £24,934 during the 1984-1985 season. For the 1991-1992 season, the average wage sat at £59,904, representing a 2.4x increase in that 8-year period. In the following 8-year period, between 1992 and 2000, the average wage would increase by 5x. This Guardian Football article from 1999 quotes Deloitte's head of football analytics in describing this growth as, quote, a sparkling performance by any normal industry standard. Tangentially, this article goes on to predict that the rise in wages would be, quote, unsustainable in the longer term, and yet here we are in 2024 as PSG are paying Mbappe £61.5 million per year. With the explosion in TV revenue rising at an exponential rate, clubs across Europe were desperate to not be the ones left behind at the end of it all. And famously, one such club was Leeds United, who invested heavily in their squad in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Then chairman Peter Ridsdale could see the lucrative opportunity consistent qualification to UEFA's new and improved European Cup competition, the Champions League, could bring to Leeds United finances, and he gambled the very future of the football club on it. While qualifying for the Champions League in the 2000-2001 season and boasting matches against Barcelona, Real Madrid, Lazio and AC Milan, behind the scenes club debt racked up year on year, rising annually from £9 million to £39 million to £82 million, and eventually peaking at £119 million of debt in 2002. Leeds United failed to qualify for the Champions League during the 2002-2003 campaign and had to make drastic savings by selling players as they could no longer afford to sustain debt repayments, which were calculated upon the assumption that Leeds would stay in UEFA's lucrative European competition. Loans had even been taken out under the assumption of large gate receipts from Champions League games, which Leeds would no longer be playing in. Leeds United's unregulated and unchecked reckless gamble backfired in the most spectacular way possible, as the club were forced to sell both their training ground and their stadium in 2004 just to make ends meet. By 2005, the club announced the sale of a 50% stake to Ken Bates for £10 million, who became the new club chairman in a move that would save the club from administration and narrowly avoided the prospect of Leeds United, a club formed 86 years prior, from ending its existence. entirely. There are many other examples of clubs across Europe in this time period embarking on similarly careless financial gambles in the hope and anticipation of the glory and revenue the new footballing world may bring. Portsmouth Football Club, despite winning the 2007-2008 FA Cup, amassed such debts that they eventually became the first Premier League club to enter administration in 2009. Bolton Wanderers, despite enjoying unprecedented success with Sam Allardyce for 8 years, announced debts of £172.9 million in 2015 and entered administration. Elsewhere in Italy, Parma Football Club, who were reportedly debt-free in 2007, declared bankruptcy in 2015 and even resorted to selling their European trophies they had won back in the late 90s to raise enough cash to save the club from extinction. Even the clubs that were not falling into administration and bankruptcy were still operating under significant losses. A Deloitte report from the end of the 2008-2009 season reported that debt among Premier League clubs had reached a combined £3.3 billion. A year later in Italy, Milan would report a net loss of almost €70 million, and Deportivo La Coruña in Spain would report losses of more than £120 million. While Leeds United may have been the most prominent example, unexpected threats were emerging on the horizon too. The wave of potential in European football was not just turning the cogs in the heads of current owners of football clubs, but it was also attracting totally new ones with totally new levels of resource. In 2003, Roman Abramovich, a wealthy oligarch who made his money under untransparent and controversial circumstances by exploiting the Russian stock market and then bribing government officials to protect his assets, bought Chelsea Football Club, who began spending their way to the top. Oligarchs, hedge funds, and soon-to-be sovereign states began buying football clubs and happily joining the arms race to the top, satisfied the potential future rewards were just too good to miss, with traditional clubs such as Juventus and Bayern Munich putting pressure on authorities to enforce regulation due to being threatened by this new wave of owner wealth, and historic clubs being run into administration by overly ambitious owners who felt they had no other choice. European football was turning into a monumental PR disaster, and that was damaging for the brand, or worse, susceptible to total collapse altogether. Alarm bells started ringing at the UEFA headquarters, and new UEFA president Michele Platini had to act. After initially trying and failing to bring in a salary cap in 1999 due to European Union law, financial fair play was devised and approved by UEFA in 2009, meaning that club spending would now be limited to a percentage of the revenue the club recorded. For what it's worth, Platini was actually very clear and precise in the unveiling of his plans and stated an intention to not hurt clubs or curtail clubs from being successful. To quote Platini from this BBC article from 2009, 50% of clubs are losing money and this is an increasing trend. We need to stop this downward spiral. The rule of financial fair play is aimed at ensuring healthy, lasting viability of the clubs, and if you depend only on a rich benefactor, however, then the financial model is too volatile. More on that later. Financial fair play regulations were introduced to UEFA competitions such as the Champions League and the Europa League at the start of the 2011-2012 season, and domestic leagues across Europe followed suit with their own similar financial regulations soon after, such as the Premier League introducing the profit and sustainability rules in 2013. There is simply no doubt that financial fair play and the domestic regulations spawned from it have been nothing short of an objective success in what they set out to do. In 2017, 6 years after the introduction of the regulations, UEFA reported that for the first time since records began, First Division clubs in European football totaled a combined profit to the tune of €600 million. While financial worries and the threat of administration are still concerns for grossly mismanaged teams, the vast majority of clubs in all of European professional football are in a much healthier financial state than before the regulations were introduced. It seems like no one wants to hear it, but the state of many European football clubs back in the early 2000s, from the minnows to the giants, was simply unsustainable. Credit must be given to UEFA for outlining a set of goals and then, within 7 years of conceiving them, unequivocally reaching them. Financial fair play does work, but at what cost? You see, the problem with introducing new rules to the race halfway through is that there was no feasible way to reset the pack. Due to the large history of unregulated football ownership, many clubs were historically in a much better position to spend within their means than others. Take Inter Milan, who made enormous losses in the mid-1990s just for their wealthy owner to write off all debt and inject huge amounts of cash to stable the finances right before FFP kicked in. The UAE's takeover of Manchester City was finalised in 2008, a year before the official announcement of FFP and 4 years before the regulations would start to take effect, giving them a head start to inject the cash before they had to start accounting for it. A similar situation occurred in France as the Qatar Investment Authority became the majority shareholder of PSG in 2011 before spending a French record €108 million in the 2011-2012 season. Other clubs were already benefiting from unregulated spending via wealthy owners, such as the previously mentioned Chelsea, or were historically huge moneymakers such as Manchester United, Arsenal, Bayern Munich and Juventus, who could already boast huge revenue streams from massive gate receipts and sustained periods in the Champions League. This idea that financial fair play was only introduced to protect the established elite is entirely misguided. But there's no denying that the already wealthy clubs that could get their finances in order hugely benefited. Making sure everyone drives the speed limit was necessary to stop half of the races from crashing and burning into a fiery grave. But if you were already out in front, who would now be able to catch you? While financial fair play has its drawbacks, it's increasingly difficult to imagine any viable alternative. Wealthy oligarchs, trust funds and sovereign states should never, ever have been allowed to own football clubs, but once that horse had bolted from the stable, UEFA couldn't simply let the whole farm loose to shit all over the town or get run over by a truck. I sympathise with those that feel it's unfair that certain clubs were allowed to skip the line before the rules were enforced, but a removal of those rules would make competition in European football worse and not fairer. Firstly, even if it may not feel like it, financial regulations are the only barrier left from keeping the top clubs from moving further away from the pack. People always love to accuse FFP of protecting the big boys, as modern day football is obsessed with conspiracy theories and mistrust. But doing this overlooks the fact that removing regulation may allow wealthy, smaller clubs to spend more, but it would also allow the elite to just spend more. Just this January, we've seen many of the big clubs in the Premier League spooked by profit and sustainability rules, which has stopped them from splashing the cash and hoovering up talent domestically and across Europe to an even further degree than they already do. Come on, I mean, it's no secret that Arsenal want to buy an elite striker, but couldn't afford to this season due to financial rules. If there was no regulation, you can bet your ass that even Tony would be in an Arsenal kit right now, ripped away from Brentford mid-season. Due to poor squad planning, Manchester United have holes all over their squad, but couldn't even afford to get in some mediocre left-back cover as they are teetering on the edge of profit and sustainability. Liverpool looked at Bellingham and Lavia and Caicedo and couldn't balance the books well enough to obtain any of them, and had to settle for a cheaper option in Endo. Bayern Munich couldn't even get Paulinho out of Fulham, and Barcelona have resorted to playing a 16-year-old on their right wing due to the lack of ability to afford new talent. The top clubs across Europe not only have revenue coming out of their ears, they are also backed by eye-wateringly wealthy owners who are, in some cases, literal Middle Eastern countries with pseudo-unlimited money, who are also not afraid to invest. What's important to note here is that it's not that these clubs can't afford to buy their targets because they don't have the money. No, they can't afford to buy their targets because they risk penalties from the Bundesliga, La Liga, and the Premier League for breaking the financial rules that are in place. And I think this has directly led to a greater degree of competitiveness. It's just inherently more interesting to watch football managers find on-pitch solutions to injury concerns and squad issues, rather than just immediately throwing money at it. Yes, the money will be thrown at it eventually, maybe at the end of the season or gradually over the course of a few. But for now, we've had players like Amrabat and Lindelof awkwardly having to play fullback, Johnny Evans having a surprise second wind in his career, Arsenal giving literally everyone a go up front just to see what sticks, Joe Gomez having to fill in for Robertson, and youth prospects like Lewis Miley, Kobbie Mainoo and Connor Bradley thrust into first-team Premier League action due to lack of options, and that's great to see. One major source of the debate around relaxing FFP, or accusing UEFA of only implementing it in the first place to protect the big boys, has reared its head again as Newcastle United, now majority owned by Saudi Arabia, although I guess not officially, they would argue, had a rough January transfer window where they failed to obtain targets despite the huge amount of investment their new Saudi overlords could theoretically provide. The argument of how can we compete with the big boys if they don't let us spend our money completely fails to realise that if they let Newcastle United spend what they want, they also have to let the big boys spend what they want, and Newcastle United would still lose that race. The elite clubs across Europe drop hundreds of millions of pounds every transfer window, sometimes close to that amount on just one player, and they still manage to meet financial regulations. Just imagine how much money they'd be able to spend if there were none. Every semi-decent player in the Premier League to hit a run of form would immediately be swept up to sit on the bench at a big club. Sorry, Brentford, we know you're in a relegation scrap right now, but the Cronkays have just signed off on another £100 million, so we're having Tony. Sorry, Bournemouth, Solanke has found his shooting boots, but Newcastle's wealth is as large as the GDP of Saudi Arabia, so he's theirs now. Deal with it. This ideology that without financial regulation, top divisions across Europe would be some sort of utopia of fair and diverse competition is a fallacy for two reasons. Number one, those at the top are already so far ahead that removing financial barriers would simply allow them to pull away even further. And secondly, not all clubs are an attractive proposition to an oligarch, a hedge fund, or sovereign state ownership. Newcastle United were, with their humongous loyal following, geographical catchment area, established household name, and giant modern stadium. But what about clubs like Brentford, Crystal Palace, Bournemouth, Luton Town, or Sheffield United? Well, those clubs would be left with no choice but to do a Leeds to try and ensure that they don't get left behind in the arms race. Those clubs would have to risk it all in the great wage race to even stay remotely competitive, all at the risk of administration, insolvency, or annihilation. Or these clubs would simply have to get onto their hands and knees and beg and plead to the wealthy elite who know nothing about football or possess any connection to the town or the club to come along and take control of everything and pump them full of money. Clubs with hundreds of years of history up and down the country sold off one by one to billionaire American businessmen or Middle Eastern crown princes. As Platini said when I quoted him earlier, you cannot have a model where every club must depend on a rich benefactor. You cannot have a model where clubs are run as toys, twerking for the wealthy elite in the hopes of a takeover. And you cannot have a model where you outsource competitiveness to sovereign states. Oh, and by the way, who's to say all of these billionaires are even going to stick around? Yeah, owning a football club and pumping hundreds of millions into it may seem feasible now, but what if the landscape around European football changes? What if it no longer makes sense to continue funneling in money and paying huge wage bills? You know, it's ironic that much of the outrage recently has been from Newcastle United fans because their club is more susceptible to complete abandonment from their current ownership than any other. The Saudis are around now, and if they had it their way and without those pesky FFP regulations, maybe they would have enticed Mbappe by paying him £200 million a year for 10 years or something. But as we get closer to the conclusion of Saudi Vision 2030, who's to say they won't reevaluate the amount they've spent on their sport washing endeavours and pull out entirely? It's no skin off their nose. If owners are allowed to spend freely and offer contracts that are only accounted for by the money coming out of their own pockets, those contracts will still legally have to be paid if said owner decides to cut ties and disappear. Financial fair play helps ensure that enough of the costs are covered by incomings outside of cash injections from investors to prevent total demolition if the Crown Prince decides that he's just a bit bored of it all now. Football clubs are more than just a team or a name on a table. Football clubs are beacons of community, prides of cities, and representations of their supporters. Football clubs in Europe simply work differently and mean more than other sports in other places in the world, and while it may seem acceptable for NFL teams to be bought, sold, moved across the country, or dismantled, this is an unacceptable outcome for clubs with years of history and culture. You cannot have iconic clubs going bust because the top 7 quadrupled their wage bills and they risked it all trying to play catch up. You cannot have iconic clubs going bust because the wealthy owner has spent too much money and has now fucked off, leaving someone else to pay it. And with all that said, we haven't even really scraped the surface of what the footballing world without financial regulation would even look like. As much as it seems some people want to, you can't just detach the top of the game from the rest, and I haven't even begun to mention the wider footballing pyramid and the lower divisions. Clubs in the lower tiers already hang on a financial knife edge to try and make it to the top, as the top divisions are just so exponentially more lucrative. Now imagine a situation where there's an even greater reward with even greater risks. We already have an issue with parachute payments and yo-yo clubs who spend a season or two in the first division before completely dominating the second division following relegation. Either this issue would worsen, or even more lower league clubs would go bust trying to chase the dream. In reality, I think the level of anger and mistrust around financial fair play is just a wider symptom of the frustration felt towards the enforcement of the rules and the administrations that enforce them, rather than the rules themselves. Following the announcement that Everton would be docked 10 points, the first Premier League club to ever be officially sanctioned since the introduction of the profit and sustainability rules, many immediately turned their anger towards Manchester City, the 115 rule breaches they are charged with, and the Premier League's inability to conclude them yet. When little old Everton, a club who seemingly haven't made any outstanding glamour signings, or if they have, they've been mostly ineffectual, are getting done by the big bad Premier League, and yet Manchester City haven't yet. The optics don't look good. If you look at it through this lens, it can totally seem like Manchester City are being protected and Everton are being thrown to the wolves. The simplest explanation, of course, is that the two cases are just very different. Everton, charged with just one breach over an accounting dispute, is a relatively simple case that can be charged, judged, and appealed quickly. Even here, Everton's breach of profit and sustainability rules dates back all the way to the 21-22 season, owing a time period of roughly 18 months before a punishment was eventually finalised. And this is just one charge. City's 115 breaches is an astronomically complex and time-consuming legal endeavour, no doubt full of red herrings, filibusters, legal delays and time-wasting tactics from the defendants. Manchester City's 115 charges is a topic too big for this video, but, and I'm sorry to say, they ultimately have no bearing on Everton's situation. Every club in the league knows the rules around profit and sustainability, and you don't get a free pass to break them just because you think someone else has. Once Manchester City's charges have been finalised, you can draw your own conclusions regarding how the Premier League has treated the proceedings, but until then, one has no bearing on the other, despite how much more blatant Manchester City's financial doping may seem. Although I back the Premier League introducing their own financial regulations, as I've already covered so far, there is no doubt that they also deserve their fair share of criticism for the way they've gone about enforcing them. Firstly, it's no surprise that the Premier League seemed content to sit on their hands and twiddle their thumbs about potential rule breaches right up until the time the threat of an independent regulator reached UK parliamentary discussion and it became clear that they might lose some control due to their negligence. And secondly, the implementation of the rule, which monitors a club's financial threshold over the course of multiple seasons, has given clubs too much wiggle room to exploit. The Premier League have had too much of a hands-off approach when it comes to enforcing their own financial rulings. Present Premier League profit and sustainability rules limit clubs to losses of £105 million over a 3-year period, essentially allowing football clubs to do whatever they want for 3 years, and then after that period, the Premier League will get around to looking at the books. This has led to situations where clubs awkwardly try and predict future revenues to understand how much they can spend now to sneak under the £105 million limit by the end of the period. It's a confusing situation for fans who sit around and question why certain clubs can spend so big in one window while others can't, and why clubs are being punished for transfers they sanctioned years prior. The Premier League methodology not only differs from UEFA's implementation of similar rules, but from other domestic leagues across Europe. La Liga has an incredibly strict implementation in which the Spanish Federation won't let a club register new players unless they can prove they can afford it for that very season. This is why we've seen Barcelona pulling all kinds of financial levers to obtain enough cash flow to be able to register Lewandowski, Gundogan and the like, because they can't take the huge losses now and then attempt to recover them by the end of the period like Premier League clubs can. And now look, if you're a certain Real Madrid or Barcelona president, you'll argue that this enforcement of the rule is too strict and prevents their clubs from being able to compete with the rest of Europe as they are held to higher standards. But from a fan perspective, the whole thing is simply much easier to understand, and for other clubs in Spain, surely much easier to abide by. This idea that European football is broken and the elite clubs are unreachable is not an entirely unwarranted one. I've spoke about it myself here on this very channel. Curtailing the top clubs and redistributing resources to create a fairer and more unpredictable league system across Europe is needed, but removing all financial regulation to allow as many clubs as possible to spend beyond their means is not the way to go about it. There are many other ways we can approach this. A salary cap may not be feasible due to EU law, but what about restrictions on squad sizes? Germany, France and Italy have zero restrictions in terms of squad sizes, so if you have extreme wealth, why wouldn't you hoover up as much talent as you can and then just register them all? England has a maximum squad size of 25, but players under the age of 21 don't need to be registered to play, which has inadvertently encouraged big teams to spend wildly on talented youngsters from academies around the world, as this effectively adds squad depth with no penalty. It's all well and good being super wealthy, but only if you have the space to register new signings. Teams aren't going to spend hundreds of millions on players that they can't even play. And if not that, how about limiting the amount of new players that can be registered in a single transfer window? Not only would this prevent new owners from flushing clubs with cash and then propelling them up the league overnight, but it would also enforce super wealthy clubs to truly evaluate every purchase they make. Calvin Phillips was everything to Leeds United, but was simply Rodri cover for Manchester City. Would they have used a hypothetical registration spot on Calvin Phillips that transfer window had push come to shove? Maybe they would have just not spent the money on him and he may have stayed at Leeds, or he could have ended up somewhere else where he actually played football. These are just a couple of thoughts from the top of my head really, but the solution here is to rein in the big boys by other means while keeping well-intended and objectively successful financial rules that protect all clubs up and down the pyramid firmly in place. The seemingly lackadaisical and confusing approach from the Premier League regarding their financial rules, coupled with things like fan frustration over VAR, a growing influence from the Middle East, and misinformation generated and spread over social media, has led to a total skepticism of financial regulations too, and those that enforce them. My argument here is that despite the many gripes you may have with FFP and other financial regulations, it's not the rules themselves that are the issue here, and the sport without them would be infinitely worse. Look, at the end of the day, I think it's pretty simple. Whichever club I support should be able to do whatever they want, and let's go and buy all the good players from the teams below us, and all the clubs that I don't support should have to follow the rules. You cheats, you cheaters, cheats.